unit is on evolution, and you can't really talk about our modern concept of evolution without talking about Darwin. And so, where did Darwin's idea come from? He didn't come from it all on its own. There was this intellectual context that existed of known information, arguably going back to Aristotle, I'd suppose. But really, if you're really looking at the sort of ideas that were in Darwin's head when he came up with this concept, you're looking at a few different people that you can kind of see here on this timeline. Hutton, for example, he was studying geology and looked at the layers and strata of the Earth and proposed the idea of gradualism. Basically, that profound geological change takes place through cumulative effects of slow but continuous processes. Thomas Malthus was looking at population principles and competition and over reproduction. So, this idea that there are more organisms than we can really support. Lamarck is one of the earlier ideas of evolution. He has his own slide in a moment. Cuvier was studying vertebrate fossils, and he talked about paleontology in the strata, and that more dissimilar fossils will be found in older strata of rock. And Cuvier eventually proposed this idea of so-called catastrophism, speculating that the boundaries between these rock strata were due to floods or droughts or other things that destroyed the species were present. And then those areas were then repopulated from unaffected areas. Lyell is the father of modern geology, looking at how rocks form within the context of this information. So he proposed this uniformitarianism idea, which basically holds that geological processes have not changed throughout Earth's history. So if you understand geological processes and apply them, then you can have an understanding of where things are going to go in the future. So all of these things had a really strong influence on Darwin. So it didn't really come from nowhere. Darwin was not the first person to propose the idea of evolution. Lamarck was an earlier one, and even he wasn't the first one to believe in this concept of these inheritance of traits. You could really spend a whole lecture just on Lamarck's concept, but he had two traditional ideas in his discussion of heredity. The first was the idea of use versus disuse. So he theorized that individuals lose characteristics they do not require and develop characteristics that are useful. The second was to argue that acquired traits were heritable. So basically, there was this illustration of like giraffes, and they stretched their necks to reach leaves high in the tree. They would strengthen and gradually lengthen their necks. These giraffes would then have offspring with slightly longer necks. In the same way, he argued a blacksmith through his work strengthens his muscle, and thus his sons would have more muscular development. His ideas were ridiculed and discredited, but if you actually look at epigenetics, this sort of concept might at least be partially true. It seems that reversible and heritable changes can occur without changing DNA sequences, and those can then be induced and respond. So maybe he's going to end up getting the last laugh in the end. But Lamarck thought basically that evolutionary change was driven by this innate need to increase complexity. And he attempted to explain the fossil record, and while his overall relationship may not be supported, it is still foundational to our modern concept of evolution. Darwin did most of his work during his voyage on the Beagle. The goal of the Beagle was to chart poorly known stretches of the South American coastline, and because Darwin was hired more as a conversation companion to the captain than a naturalist, he had plenty of free time to explore while the crew surveyed the coast. And he collected thousands of specimens and came up with this concept by looking at the organisms that were from the mainland and looking at the organisms that were from further away. He started noticing some of these patterns and trends. Uh, Eventually, after this trip, Darwin came home. He published his journal, married his cousin, had 4 children, buried one of them, did a lot of other work, and didn't really publish his idea until 20 years later when a young naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, sent him a paper asking for his thoughts on a new theory. And it was the same theory that he eventually proposed or was proposing, and so he published the work very shortly after. And that would be on the origin of species by the means of natural selection. So Darwin is not the father of evolution or any of that thing, but he is sort of the originator of this natural selection as a major evolutionary force. If you actually read on the origin of species, there's many things that are accurate, but there's also many things that are inaccurate. Overall, Darwin defined evolution as this concept of descent with modification. Basically, that all organisms are related through descent from a common ancestor, and over time, your descendants accumulate adaptations that allow them to survive and reproduce. So Darwin proposed natural selection to explain this observable pattern. He had four key observations. Okay, first was this idea of variation. Members of populations vary in their traits. That variation becomes something that can be selected. Okay, then we have inheritance. Offspring inherit traits from their parents, so there is a link to genetics and inheritance of traits. Please realize this is pre-Mendel, so we don't really understand how it works, but there is this clear idea that you inherit traits from your ancestry. Okay, and then if you think about Malthus and the population issues, overproduction is supported here. All species are capable of producing more offspring than the environment can support. And then our last one is basically because of a lack of resources and too many offsprings, basically many offspring won't survive due to competition. That collectively will result in those selective pressures. And from that, he came up with two key inferences. Basically, that individuals who inherited traits give them a better chance of surviving and reproducing in a given environment tend to leave more offspring. We would now call that survival of the fittest. And then his second one basically was that the unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will cause favorable traits to accumulate over time. So basically, overall, evolutionary fitness is equal to differential reproductive success, and the organism that has the most offspring will contribute the most genetics over time, and giving a steady input to new variation, leading to the emergence of new species. It's not exactly a new idea that organisms are well suited to their environments and there's a rich diversity of life. Darwin's sort of fascination, what we called endless forms most beautiful, led to this idea, this descent with modification as a evolutionary pressure. In his whole work on the origin of species, he talked about many different species. However, we know now that the actual species relationship that he was proposing, and you can see on the right his sketch of what that relationship might have looked like, the only one that he was actually right about are the finches of the Galapagos. So he observed that the finches of the Galapagos were similar to the ones from South America, but that were very different, and they had diverged overall by looking at things like their beak pattern, and he noticed that that correlated, or at least had a relationship with the types of things that he was eating, or that the finches were eating, I suppose. Alfred Russel Wallace in the Spice Islands, the Malay Archipelago would be some of the modern ideas, had this idea too. And although both Darwin and Wallace developed these similar ideas independently, the theory of evolution by natural selection is attributed to Darwin because he developed his ideas earlier and supported the theory much more extensively. Basically, to Darwin, the hierarchy of organisms represents a branching tree of life, with speciation being the emergence of a new tree and extinction being the loss of a branch, and that organisms of various levels are united through descent from a common ancestor. Overall, though, natural selection is pretty straightforward. Populations have variations, elimination for those that are less adapted for their environment, reproduction of the survivors, accumulating those genes that are beneficial, will lead to change. The modern definition of evolution is not descent with modification. The modern definition of evolution is the change in allele frequency over time. Okay, so natural selection is a force that can lead to genetic change. It is not the only one that can do so. But overall, we need to realize that natural selection cannot fashion perfect organisms. Selection can only act on existing traits. It's limited by historical constraints. Many adaptations and changes are often compromises, chance, the environment, all of these things are going to interact. It gets really complicated. But natural selection is a process by which individuals that have certain heritable traits survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals because of those traits. Although natural selection occurs through interaction between individual organisms and their environment, individuals do not evolve. It is a population that evolves over time because only a population is going to have a frequency count, statistical relationship that can be studied. We know now, though, that natural selection is one of those major forces of evolutionary change, and changes in the environment are going to be the major pressure that leads to those change. So Lamarck, for example, his use and disuse and all of those things was sort of one of the early sort of precursors of adaptive change. Darwin looked at, okay, there is variation, therefore there is natural selection, therefore there is adapted change. There are other researchers that have contributed to this idea. Baldwin, for example, he pointed out that it does not have to be a physiological trait. It could be learned behavior or behavioral traits that lead to natural selection. And then we also have Waddington, who proposed this idea of genetic assimilation, basically that after generations, traits that occur within high frequencies due to phenotypic change, those traits can become part of their exposure. Say, for example, exposure to a teratogen, which is something that causes birth defects, can later become genetically encoded via natural selection. So it gets complicated. But Darwin is not the only sort of piece that leads to this overall representation. It is a group effort. One of the major patterns of evolutionary change is the so-called adaptive radiation. If there are empty niches, organisms will begin to diverge to fill those niches. So organisms are going to have competition. Competition is going to be a negative interaction. They're both going to be losing. Okay, so the ones that are more adapted, better using a certain environment, will exclude the others. And then where they overlap, there will be conflict, and where they do not overlap, there won't. So that's going to lead to some areas where they specialize, which can then lead to physiological or behavioral changes in their traits, which would be referred to as character displacement. So competition drives this process, and common ancestry is sort of the base component leading to the diversity of organisms over time. So basically, species come about through a variety of pressures, competition being one of those main ones. If you're looking at this sort of as a simulation, if you have two organisms that use the same resources, but one of them is better able to survive, in this example, the red will outcompete the blue. But if you have areas where the blue can survive that the red can't, the blue will survive in those environments. Another factor here is looking at fitness and types of selection. So we are assuming that traits exist on a normal curve because most traits are polygenic. Natural selection is a force that consistently causes adaptive evolution, and it's a sort of a blend of chance and sorting. There are three models, though, of this sort of selection process. Okay, you could have a directional selection where a extreme trait is favored due to changes in the environment, like the peppered moth on the top right. As soot became more common in the Industrial Revolution, the darker colored moths became more likely to survive. You could have a disruptive selection where both extremes are favored and you're going against the middle, like the rock pocket mice. The dark mice survive on the dark soil, the light mice survive on the light soil, and if they're in between, they don't survive anywhere. It gets problematic. Or you could have stabilizing selection, like the robin eggs on the bottom right. Too few eggs, they may not survive. Too many eggs, they may not survive. But if you favor an intermediate amount, you won't end up with malnourished chicks, and the parents will be able to survive that process. So a stable middle is much more likely to be survivable for the organisms. There are other types of selection, though. Natural selection is only one of them. Frequency-dependent selection is one where the evolutionary process is driven by a balance of phenotype or genotype. Basically, if there are multiple shapes or types, one will become too common, and then that's going to drive a shift. In this example, we have right mouth and left mouth fish. It's all a random genetic change. The right mouth ones feed, and the left mouth ones feed. And if there's too many of one side, they're going to starve. So it balances out. Frequency dependent selection could be positive. The fitness of a phenotype increases as it becomes more common, or it could be negative, where the fitness decreases as it becomes more common. But more generally, it's when biological interactions make fitness depend upon the frequency of other phenotypes. You could have sexual selection where it comes down to mate choice and mate behavior, sexual dimorphic traits. And this could be intrasexual, so it's going to be the direct competition among individuals of one sex for mates, or it could be intersexual mate choices, basically usually females choosing males for one trait or another. You can also have artificial selection. That is when there are outside pressures driving that force. Typically, we think of this as human breeding control mechanisms. It tends to be much faster than natural selection because nothing's left to chance events. But overall, evolution is a compromise. It's not goal-oriented. It is a result of variation and differential reproductive success. It's a trend. Okay, it's not always better. It can be a maladaptive thing. Surviving species don't represent the peak of perfection. There is compromise and random chance. An example of this is heterozygote advantage with sickle cell anemia. If you are fully sickle celled, that is going to be a problem. If you have no sickle cell genes, that can also be a problem because that means that you are more sensitive to malaria. But if you have one sickle cell gene, if you are a heterozygote, you are resistant to malaria and you don't have sickle cell anemia. So we get all sorts of random combinations of things where we realize that evolution is not perfection, it is survival and reproduction leading to change. Now, we also need to realize that evolution can occur on many different scales. The things that you are really probably thinking of on evolution so far are sort of microevolution. If you're looking at a single population and the changes that occur, it's a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. If you're starting to look at broader patterns, changes in these structures that occur on a large scale affecting multiple species, like speciation or extinction events, macroevolution is going to be that broader concept. It's a broad pattern that happens over time.